All right. Well, welcome everybody. Lovely to see you all. Do let me know if there are any issues with the screen or sharing or anything like that as I go. I'm going to try to multitask as best I can. All right. So we begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we stand today, including the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Narm, or what is now known as Melbourne, Australia. Those lands are where our community was thought up and began. We pay respect to their elders, lores, customs, and creation spirits, and to those of other Indigenous communities represented here today. We recognize that these lands have always been places of flourishing exploration through and by design, and that these lands were never ceded. So today we have a special treat. One of the areas of focus that we as a community have discussed exploring further together, especially this year, is the idea of regenerative design or just regeneration in general. Seeing it as a way to connect to the earth and honor our interrelatedness with our planet and also with each other. Our group was formed on the premise of putting Flourishing scholarship into practice, and a large part of Flourishing involves connection, as we know. Today, we're going to explore connection in the context of collective and planetary well-being with our honored guest, Daniel Christian Wahl. So Daniel is a consultant, educator, and activist who has a wide array of clientele, while also contributing to the Global Eco-Village Network and Gaia Education for approximately 20 years. He's the author of the book, Designing Regenerative Cultures. His blog on Medium is followed by over 20,000 people, and his social media advocacy combined an audience of over 850,000 people, which is really impressive. He was the 2021 recipient of the RSA Bicentenary Medal for Regenerative Design and is the co-host of Regeneration Rising Podcast, which I love. It's an honor to have you with our group today, Daniel.
Thanks for inviting me. Lovely
Great.
to be here.
Excellent. So happy to have you. So when I initially invited Daniel to come speak with us, he suggested a more conversational format, which was what we're going to be doing today. So to facilitate that conversation, I've invited one of our FxD members to discuss things with Daniel. This is for a variety of reasons, given my spotty internet today while on holiday, and more importantly, to better engage our community and to bring together two insightful regenerative design thinkers. So a little about Sarah, for those of you who don't know her. Sarah Barnes is a cultural strategist, researcher, and creative director with a career-long commitment to enlivening the many storied potentials of places in pursuit of multi-species well-beings. She is a co-director of design practice, Studio ESEM, and is also pursuing research on the digital dimensions of regenerative futures through RMIT University in Melbourne. So thank you so much for being here, Sarah.
Thank you, Jenna, for having me. It's certainly, an honor to have the opportunity to speak with Daniel today. Your work, Daniel, I've followed for some time, as I'm sure is the case for many of us gathered here. Just before I move on, I'm wondering, Jenna, I've got the spotlight on the slide. I'm just wondering if we need to shift that or whether that's just me, because I'm feeling
yes,
like
I'll remove that in just a moment.
I'm feeling like I can only just see Daniel in the corner, and I'd like to have a bit more co-presence.
Yeah.
Of course. Let me, if you don't mind, let me just give a brief overview of the times for the session.
Yes,
And then
thank
I'll
you.
stop sharing my screen. But yes, I agree. And then I will unspotlight myself at that time as well. So just so everybody knows the format for today, we are anticipating that the conversation will go for about 30 to maybe 40 minutes, with about 20 minutes allocated for questions. I'm going to be monitoring questions in the chat as well as in the Zoom Q&A function. So please just note them as we go, and we'll go through those at the end. So with that, as promised, I will stop sharing my screen. Hopefully. And unspotlight myself. And there you go.
Hello, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Jenna, for that introduction, and hello, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today. I too would like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded lands, actually, of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is otherwise known as Sydney. And I think, when we in Australia, we do acknowledge First Nations custodianship and the unceded nature of sovereignty here, but also recognizing that, you know, to acknowledge place and to acknowledge First Nations custodianship of where we are is also to, I guess, recognize that there is often trauma attached to place as well as healing, and that, you know, recognition of that trauma is really important to moving forward. And I feel as though the turn towards the regenerative in our, you know, in a lot of design practice is really about listening to concepts of kinship and custodianship in relation to place. And also to recognize that not everything about place is good. You know, not everything about place is about flourishing. And I guess that's where I turn to your work, Daniel, because I think you've been a real influencer in terms of putting a spotlight on the importance of culture and of listening practices as well, in relation to shifting our worldview from one of a more traditional kind of Western science and even a version of kind of extractive knowledge creation towards living in complexity at the local level. So I just would love to hear from you, you know, I know your work, particularly from designing regenerative cultures, and I'd love to hear what it's been like for you to have watched that upswing and as a global movement, what it's been like for you to really dwell in place and to connect to conditions of place as you've grown in popularity over that time.
There's so many other places where I also would like to go. For me, the time from when my book was published to now, I've been in a process of deepening into place here on the island of Mallorca. I in 2010 made the decision that I wanted to return to the Mediterranean because my childhood was spent, like the happy times of my childhood was spent in the Mediterranean with my grandmother. And so I'm imprinted on this landscape, this place. The Mediterranean is. I've always felt more Mediterranean than German, but my passport is German. And having worked at the scale of communities for quite some time with the Global Eco-Village Network and through Gaia Education, and also through the Transition Town movement, I realized before I came here that place has this fractal dimension, and yes, the kind of intimate community scale of your neighbors and your close community is vitally important, but the scale of really inhabiting place is at a slightly larger landscape scale. Multiple communities within the confines or the conditions of a particular landscape and culture. And for me, coming to Mallorca was a way of throwing an anchor after having moved 28 times with my partner before we stopped moving across Europe mainly, but also across continents. And I'm still in the middle of that process of seeing what commitment to a place, to saying we cannot heal the planet, we can only heal places. We cannot really have big discussions at international conferences like the COP process, where 50,000 people try to solve the global problem of climate change. We can only enact a different relationship to place and to life that would, if we all did it in all places, solve the problem of climate change. And so for me, that's really been on multiple levels, both how do you work with systems and how do you transform them when you're actually part of them and when they're far beyond your control. But also then at the personal level, in the last 3-4 years, I've become a custodian of a little bit under a hectare of land that I've been bringing back to life in the last 4 years and the actual learning of what it means to grow roots, the linguistic turn of phrase, I'm growing roots in this place. But when you're actually growing roots, like I planted 420 trees that are now growing roots. And I have a personal relationship with each and every one of those trees on a daily basis, walking around, checking on them, nurturing them. And then you can really get the reciprocity that happens when we align with what I would call is life's regenerative impulse. Like for me, it's important to understand that regeneration is not some kind of new concept. It's a fundamental process of life that happens in every cell of our bodies. It happens in the diverse ecosystem that we refer to as our bodies, because we're much more non-human cells than we're human cells, and that diversity in our gut flora and our mouth flora on the skin, all of that is actually what we need to flourish or be healthy. And so how do we align with this process by which life creates conditions conducive to life within that nested complexity, from the cellular to the organ to the individual to the family to the community to the bioregion, the ecosystem, and the planet. And that for me, it basically has been my exploration for the last 20 years. How do we participate appropriately in a system that we can't predict and control?
Yeah, thank you. And I think the chance for many of us here, it's evening for me, but I know we have many who are different time zones, including yourself, much more early in the day. But my interest in hearing from you today and talking with you is to really kind of get that understanding of what is your life like now? What is your day-to-day life like? Because it's wonderful to kind of have read your work and to kind of you're such a strong kind of sharer of updates and developments and bright sparks from around the world. And I guess it's that sense of what does it mean to dwell in place and to take notice of the world around you, to actually substantiate these ideas in a lived way. And I think that to me is the core of a kind of flourishing perspective as well, is to take that integrative approach to well-being that is very much thinking about what it is to our health, our kind of our cellular nature, and the way that our cellular natures are connected to other life forms. It's a very different way of thinking that very much connects to the idea of flourishing. I love this quote that we cannot act wisely without making sense of the world, and making sense of the world is in itself a profoundly practical action that informs how we experience reality and how we act and the relationships that we formed. I guess I'd love to hear from you about that idea of the practical action. What are some of the most practical kind of actions that are inspiring you at the moment? Perhaps moving beyond that sense of putting down roots in your local environment to perhaps some of the ways in which they're branching out into new directions.
It's interesting because it's an opportunity to sort of foreground a different way of working with the world and in the world, where designers and design can be a little bit misleading, because design can very easily be understood as doing something to the system, where we have the agency, we have the idea, and then we transform the system by design. And even the title of my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, is a paradox. The cultures cannot be designed. Cultures emerge out of the sum total of the relationships and interactions and information flow within a network, so it's, for me, paying attention to not just how our intentionality shapes the world, but how we are constantly shaped by the sum total of our ancestors' design for the world. Like Tony Fry, the Australian design philosopher, once said, "Design goes on designing," and we're not paying enough attention to that. Like Winston Churchill apparently said, first we design our buildings and then our buildings shape us, or first we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And it's this reciprocal, like understanding that when you go further upstream in the design process, any act of engagement that shifts worldviews and ways of relating is actually an act of design. And so that's why a lot of my point of intervention is through education, because if you create collective sense-making processes, in my book I call it Living the Questions Together, about how are we related to each other, how are we related to this place, how are we related to the story of place, and how can we listen to life itself, what wants to emerge here. All of that is a lived practice. And I believe that our ancestors everywhere had that practice, and we made a major mistake when, blinded by the power of science and technology, we thought that we could call cultures that had been dwellers in place, like the cultures you both acknowledged, on whose lands you are, for sometimes 100,000 years in Australia. They have managed to live in place in right relationship. And we had the arrogance when Cook arrived to say they don't have any agriculture. No, they had an agricultural system so sophisticated that Cook was unable to see it. And so how do we work with the way that the concepts and organizing ideas of who we are shape how we then act in the world? And so for me, the bringing in the worldview dimension, bringing in the conversation around our fundamental interconnectedness, that we are literally like fruit bodies of a planetary mycelium. Like we just pop up briefly and we are part of life. We're not separate from nature and the living fabric. But our meta design of culture has a discourse where the designed world, the technological world, the cultural world has grown out and beyond nature and is somehow above it. And it is that narrative that is the fundamentally degenerative design that causes us to be not in right relationship. And so I work on that as an educator in different ways. I work with ETH Zurich, as we set up a MOOC on designing resilient and regenerative systems, where we try to bridge the kind of science and engineering excellence of a university like ETH with indigenous ways of knowing and place-based sensing and a bioregional approach that pays attention to the scales of design. But then also, like through Gaia Education, we've been including the worldview dimension into the approach to sustainability for 20 years. So it was always rather than a three-legged stool, social, ecological, and economic. There was the worldview dimension, or the spiritual cultural dimension, that actually informs how we see it, look at things socially, ecologically, and economically. And what I do locally here to bring it more concrete is to work with NGOs and with business classes and with the regional government. Sometimes, like at the moment, I don't do so much work with the government, but it's all really building relationship over 15 years. And as a foreigner, you have to be very careful of how you intervene in any way with the system, because I'm not from here. First have to learn. And what's happening now is that we're aligning NGOs that had previously either a marine focus or a terrestrial focus into an alliance that is actually working the integration between marine and terrestrial ecosystems restoration at this point. But it's really with view of looking at how would we redesign the Balearic Archipelago in a way that we re-regionalize the local economy, or how we meet regional needs increasingly from regional production for regional consumption. It's a reversing of some of the trends of globalization, in a refitting back into this landscape and making that process an economic driver for making the island greener and dealing with the water cycle and growing more biomass and all of that. So it ultimately turns into very practical action on the ground. It's community pride campaigns in different villages around the island, around their relationship to the sea, working with landowners in the mountains, in the Tramontana mountain range. So there's knowledge exchange wherever you have pioneers that are already doing things in a more regenerative land care practice, so they can start learning from each other, and these examples can kind of start to travel to other landowners. That means bringing in funding from off-island, like these kind of processes are normally kickstarted by philanthropic funding, but they ultimately then need to get more structural funding in place once they're running. So yeah, keep myself busy.
No, it's really good to hear that kind of that overview, I suppose, of the sorts of work that you're doing currently. And you've touched on a number of kind of questions that I wanted to ask you. The role of education, you spoke about this early on just then, and the way that you lean into the educational pathways rather than design per se, because of the ways in which that can support the relational work in a more sustaining way. I'd love to hear from you, given the longevity of your practice over the last couple of decades. Sometimes when one is working in a place-based way, and particularly in the kind of against an extractive economy towards an alternate regenerative style economy, one feels as though initiatives can be more at the smaller scale or the experimental or the pilot stage or what have you. I'd love to hear how you see the kind of longevity or the stability or the kind of growing resilience, if you like, of the kinds of networks that you're engaged with. So Gaia Education, Eco Village Network, those sorts of organizations. How do you see those networks having evolved in the last couple of decades? And do you see that there's this growing kind of strength and resilience to these networks? And perhaps I should add into that the kind of bioregionalism networks, because that's another kind of mycelial kind of support structure for the kinds of positive futures of flourishing that we're all kind of all about here.
That's a really interesting question, but I have to kind of almost answer it in a kind of time horizon, because basically, historically, if you now look at for example, the Bioregional Learning Center in the UK, they have a wonderful little article that sort of describes why are we taking this bioregional approach, where they refer to some work that Donella Meadows did with the Balloton Group, where when they looked even back in the 1970s at how would we actually bring human activity back into alignment with the way life regenerates itself. Even back then, they suggested it needed back then they called it bioregional learning centers, that it needed places where people would use the best of science, but make it concrete rather than abstract through applying science to getting to know their place better. And then having the capacity to not turn science into scientism and say this is the only way we can know this place, but have other ways of knowing also practice at the same center. And at the same time, the idea was that these places shouldn't be just academic, they should be transforming their bioregion and create examples of how things could be done differently. And little known fact historically is that Ross T. Jackson, who is the philanthropic funder behind setting up the Global Eco Village Network and Gaia Education, was also a member of the Balloton Group. And so was John Todd, who, together with Donella Meadows, had this idea. And John is kind of the founding father of ecological design with the work that he did with the New Alchemy Institute as early as 1969, where also, if you look at the principles of the New Alchemy Institute, they also said we need to look at the bioregional scale. And so there's a deep connection. Ross first sent Robert Gilman and his wife Diane across the world to visit these experimental communities that had set up in the 60s and 70s in different contexts, like the farm in Tennessee and Findhorn in Scotland and Oroville in India and Damanhur in Italy. And then Robert Gilman looked at them as models for sustainable living in the 21st century was the framing back then. And they superimposed what they found in the different places and basically said none of those places are a perfect model, but if you put them on top of each other, a picture emerges that could be a model. And that's what Robert called eco-villages, and that's how the term eco-village evolved. And then they brought all these communities together at a conference in Findhorn in 1995 and set up the Global Eco-Village Network. And then they were wondering, how do we activate this network further? And funded an educational side where eco-village educators from these eco-villages from the Global North and the Global South developed the original Gaia Education curriculum mandala, where social, ecological, economic, and worldview are the 4 dimensions, and whole systems design is the means of implementation, inspired by Bill Mollison's design-based approach and all of that. And so these networks are fundamentally connected. If you're asking me what's the state of flourishing of Gen and Gaia Education at the moment, not so great, because what I would say Gaia Education is doing wonderful, actually, having got through the difficult time where after many decades of funding, the Gaia Trust, Ross Jackson's funding organization, basically ran out of money and decided that they couldn't fund the core funding of the organizations anymore. And so both the Global Eco-Village Network had to pivot and Gaia Education. Gen is still like when in the year where it's the 30th anniversary of the Global Eco-Village Network and the 20th anniversary of Gaia Education, and there will be a gathering in Hungary, but because both organizations are still reestablishing themselves after losing at the same time their funding and the 2 powerful female leaders that had guided them for quite some years. It's a little bit of a sad anniversary year because there isn't that much energy. I've been very of finance behind it, to be honest, but energy on the grassroots, there's still a huge amount. But the impact of both of those organizations on people over 20 years or 30 years of I know people who did I did the first Eco-Village Design Education course that was held at Findhorn in 2006, using my last postdoctoral research money from the University of Dundee. And then I moved sideways and became the director of Findhorn College after that. And that was in 2006. I know, like, even the people that were in that cohort, to see where they now are, how they're acting in the world, and how deeply they're still informed by that month-long experience of that course, or to see how particularly in Brazil, there have been so many Gaia education courses that there's a kind of social activist layer in society that call themselves the Gaianos. And if you move from one city to the other, you can already connect with this tribe because they have a shared framework in common of having mapped action at the local, regional, and planetary scale through this curriculum. And the last thing that also relates to your question, how do these small or regional initiatives connect to the global? When I did my PhD between 2003 and 2006 at the University of Dundee, I thought I was going to do a PhD on design for sustainability, the holistic framework. But even then, I realized that the word sustainability doesn't give us a clarity of what it is that we're actually trying to sustain. You need to get a Brundtland definition of sustainability to get an idea of what does this actually is this about. And back then, I called my PhD Design for Human and Planetary Health. And this understanding, then, when we're talking about sustaining something or how positively influence something through design, what we're actually trying to do is to sustain health as an emergent property at different levels of scale. Again, from the organ, the individual, the family, the community, all the way up to the planetary. And the notion of a dynamic, positive attitude towards dealing with health that Aaron Antonovsky developed in the 1960s, the salutogenic approach to health, I then applied to design. I think I first used this notion of salutogenic design. And for me, like, one of my mentors was David Orr, and David had already in an earlier book said we urgently need a Hippocratic oath for designers. And for me, the whole framework of scale linking design for human and planetary health offers us a regenerative framework of how to work with design to heal systems. And the notion of scale linking is really important there, because once we look at the scales of design from material science to product design to architecture to urban planning to industrial ecology and bioregional or regional planning, all of those scales are regional. Like, so we can actually use the power of design as a way of exploring how can we participate appropriately in this place and make the arbiter of what is good design or bad design. Does it support the health of individuals, communities, and the planet? It's a very simple question. And that would give design as a discipline a values north. But it also, the last scale there is that these regionalized systems need to be supported by a global collaboration. So it's not a sort of back to everybody living like we lived 500 years ago. It's more, can we flip it? Most communities now have 80% global provisioning and maximum 20% local provisioning. But in terms of resource and energy use, it would be so much more efficient if we had 80% regional provisioning that is enabled by a very critically looked at 20% of what needs to flow globally to enable people to build those regional economies. And it's the danger right now, and the danger with some of the bioregionalism movement at the moment is that their narrative is almost like building a life raft in the face of collapse and building these. It's almost repeating some of the early stories of the eco villages 20 years later. And the important bit, to tie a bow to this long spiel to the answer to your question, is we need to connect the depth of knowledge that is in the eco village movement that already understood that it has to be holistic, and B, that they made a mistake by being only focused on the small scale, that you actually needed to look at how does the regional connect to the national and to the global and activate a positive relationship there. And I think it's happening. There's wonderful examples now of people working in different ways with bioregionalism, bioregional weaving labs, design school for regenerating Earth, the kind of Bioregional Learning Alliance. And I see all of them as experiments on how we are coming home to place, and with it also coming home to life, coming home to our understanding that we are actually capable of being regenerative custodians of place. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. That was a beautiful large sweep of possibilities and I guess hopeful orientations. Particularly, you touched on a couple of questions that I had lined up, which was really, I think, directly to this group is, how do you kind of build emergent, new ways of doing things, transdisciplinary ways of doing things within established institutions, and what are the practices involved in doing that? And I feel as though you've kind of answered that through the kind of intentionality around positioning a value, the value of health, of flourishing at multiple scales, and that as being intentional, and then looking at the scales at which that can operate, and thinking through the shifts not as a closure from one to another, but really thinking through the connectivities of scale as in fact part of the design challenge. I did want to say also that I just love the image that's behind you at the moment, and it's, I guess, what it says about this idea of linking scales and the way that we can see the kind of porosity that exists between places, but also I see that there's a little bit of I think that there is bioregionaling.
Well, it's Robert
Okay.
Zooks' map of the river systems of the planet.
Okay,
So
beautiful.
when we all close our eyes and we bring up what we've been taught in geography classes, the map of the world, it's a map with all these strange straight lines that were literally drawn by the ruler of a ruler. These are socio-political structures of the last 200 years in most cases. Not many of them are older. And they're the product of a power over system. These maps behind me, the rivers, are biophysical realities. They are the watersheds where, when it rains, the water flows into the rivers and back into the sea. They're part of the larger hydrological cycle and the flow of water that maintains life on planet Earth. And so traditionally, in the re-emergence of our ancient practice as a species, like I believe that bioregioning, being dwellers in place, has been our species' long-term evolutionary survival pattern for most of our species journey. And it's only what we call history, the last 10,000 years, is the aberrant experiment of a species that thinks it can over harvest the basis on which it depends. And it starts with city-states, and it turns into nation-states, and then it turns into empires, and now it's turning into power block battles and all of that. And that's the mistaken narrative. And if we don't come back to understanding that the people that we called primitive actually, had a way of communicating intergenerationally how to be in right relationship with the land, and had a way of dwelling in place that actually worked for many millennia, hundreds of thousands of years. And so for me, that's the big journey here is to how do we return to bioregional dwelling patterns as a way of that is the scale where we can heal the damage that we've done. We can bring back the health of the topsoil, the health of our forests, of our rivers, and the health of our oceans. And the reason why we can is because nature is incredibly regenerative. It's like the biggest ally here is nature's capability to regenerate. We just need to align with the patterns that allow natural systems to regenerate and integrate back into them.
Indeed. I'm just conscious of time, and I know that we did want to make sure we have some time for others to ask questions. Jenna, would you say it'd be a nice time to open up the floor to the group at hand? Please let me know,
yes.
anyone. Yeah.
I haven't seen any questions come through, just some comments in the chat so far, but I have a couple myself, so I'm happy to jump in unless you wanted to continue any thoughts between the both of you. But
maybe the one thing, because we're in a design-based context, there's one thing that I'd like to point out to designers is that there's a tendency in design education to be focused on the object of design, like some kind of deliverable at the end, like you get a brief by a client and then you do something and then there's a deliverable and you hand over that designed system, that object, that house, that district. And the shift of perspective to really work regeneratively is to not be so centered on that outcome, not be so solution focused, like this whole spiel about designers are solutioneers, or give us the problem, we're the designers, we give you the solution. If we can be more humble with these projects, it doesn't mean that we're not going to have deliverables, it doesn't mean that we don't have outcomes and all that, but to work regeneratively asks the question of how do I design this process that the investment into that building or that product actually outlives that building and that product, because as we're journeying towards that building and that product, we are creating a different way of holding the wider system and a different capacity to actually interfere with that system in everybody who gets touched by the design process, from the supply chain of the materials and the energies to make the product, to the research of how it might be used, to all the layers, the context in which it will be used. And if we design our processes like that, where it's great, we have some investors that want us to do this. So how do we do it in a way that people fall in love with this place and each other again? How do we do it in a way that people become right custodians of this place? How do we do it in a way that people are capable of questioning our design when it stops fitting context? Because the problem with this design goes on designing is that we very often then just repeat designs that are not fit for context anymore. And so I just wanted to nuance that out because it's something that it doesn't get taught a lot in a lot of design schools.
Yeah. And that's very much what I wanted to touch on with my question. And then I have one from Stephen that I'll get to, but I'm so happy you brought up solutioneering and solutionizing, Daniel, because I know that's something that you've spoken about before. And, for the people within our community, we do have a mixture of so many disciplines, researchers, practitioners, people who really are in those gray areas that is oftentimes just categorized as transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary. And while that work is interesting and a lot of us are driven by doing that work, it's quite difficult to easily fit into the societal structure, as I'm sure you're aware and may have experienced. But, it's this round peg, square hole, or vice versa sort of condition. And I think part of the problem is that we do have people who are wanting to do the work and, have done a lot of homework to prepare themselves to do it. And it's just a matter of sometimes of seeing how we can actually work into the system. And I personally believe part of it is the educational system itself, how we're trained, how everything is so siloed disciplinarily, but then also within the actual career pathways and the roles that exist. Like my roles always have to be created for me. So that's something I personally experience, but that's a very difficult way of living when you just want to do work. And I think to do this work, especially from a point of something that is true and authentic, it oftentimes requires that partnership, the trusted partnership. So how can we maybe navigate some of those necessities to tackle these wicked problems and deliver on design sorts of work without necessarily only doing things that, like what Carol Samford has said, I think she says something along the lines of like yesterday's design solutions are really today's problems. So do you have any suggestions on
That's a
that?
quote out of my book. I don't know if Carol
Is it
said it.
really? Carol said it on Tyson's podcast.
It's actually that's it. Nice that she said that, but that's definitely out of my book.
Funny.
So good, because it wasn't always clear whether Carol was also listening. But that's nice to hear. But yeah, that's the whole point. Is that that's why we need to live the questions. Like in my book, that's what the whole book
Yeah.
kind of spirals around. Is that we are solution focused and outcome focused. And in doing that, we think that we solve our problems permanently. But if you actually, like I ask at the beginning of the question of the book, is there a set of design principles and guidelines that you can, like, this is what you have to do in order to be regenerative? And I don't think so. Um, there is a set of questions that people have to keep asking and keep evolving in order to keep living the learning process that is actually inherent in life's regenerative process. So that we will never get there. And we need to even, and this is this why when I sat there trying to write the book, I said, what can I actually write about here that in 10 years or in 15 years isn't completely irrelevant? Because if you write about solutions, when you give them the 10, 15, 20-year time frame, they look really kind of outdated. And that's why I shifted and said, no, this needs to be question focused. There are 250 questions in the book. And I'm not saying those are the questions and don't ask any other ones. No, it's the invitation to constantly ask questions. How do I relate to self? How do I relate to community? How do I relate to life? And that sort of triethica structure is in pretty much all the indigenous traditions. It's the guiding path of and the practice of living it as a question rather than seeing it as a solution process is what is fundamentally regenerative. It is there are no recipes, not even the lineage of Carol Sanford and Regenesis is the recipe. It's a wonderful lineage and you can learn a lot in it, but it's not the way to access regeneration in the world. Regeneration doesn't need to be accessed, it happens everywhere. What it needs to be is unveiled. It's the same, maybe that's another important bit that people sometimes ask me, what would you write differently now with regard to your book? And I have a sense that I wasn't clear enough in the way I was talking about regenerative cultures to bring them into the present of the now and not have them like another transition from here to there framing. The entire proposition of regenerative futures can be completely misleading because it again pushes people into the future. But the future never gets changed anywhere else but here, right now. We cannot change things in the future. We can only change them here, right now. And paying attention to the regenerative future potential of the present moment is a complete shift of how we design interventions. And it's about understanding that every act of caring, sharing, nurturing, rooting in place, maintaining the language, the lineage, the law of place that you were both honoring at the beginning of this call. Those are fundamentally regenerative acts that human beings are engaged in every community on the planet right now. And to work regeneratively with community in place is to make the system see those acts again. It's the same with the conversation about what is a regenerative economics and here are the principles to create a regenerative economy and singular in the conversation very often. That's completely mistaken. If you want to talk about it, it has to be in plural. But again, I think the powerful reframe about regenerative economics is not to say we need to redesign capitalism and create a new system that we then implement and then we live happily ever after, but it's actually to pay attention to the economics of life. We all had mothers, we all had fathers, some of us have children and are nurturing them. That is a process of regeneration. We're embedded in this living fabric that is the economy of life. All acts like what we call the economy would not exist if we made an economic transaction out of every act of caring, nurturing, and sharing that happens all the time. And so what I'm saying is the regenerative economy is already there. We're just not paying attention to it. And the regenerative cultures are already there, but the narrative is about problems rather than potential, and therefore it also is blind to that potential. So what we're actually doing as weavers, activators of the living fabric, is to just connect acts of regeneration to each other, shape the narrative that grounds people into place and binds people into a larger relationship to time and place and being in right relationships. Anyway, get off the soapbox.
No, that's a beautiful narrative. And I think you say it so well too, with the layered perspective and scale of health. So the individual, societal, regional, and planetary. But I don't want to take up too much of the time. I could talk to you all day, which is why I brought Sarah in. But I know, Stephen, you had a question. Did you want to voice that yourself? I don't know.
Let's see, what evidence do you draw?
Yeah.
The question from Mark. What evidence do you draw upon to give you confidence that we can fundamentally change humanity towards a flourishing and regenerative future?
Well,
So, do you want to answer this one from Mark? Thanks, Mark.
I think we're at a point where the dominant culture has not valued the importance of rite of passage rituals for so long that we've been led by uninitiated teenagers that thought they could just continue to keep taking for too many centuries. And that has led us to a point with climate change and the collapse of systems that no longer serve, that we're now clearly in the middle of, that is pushing humanity into a species level rite of passage. We are actually no longer certain that our children's children's children will still exist. We might be members of a species on the path to extinction. And I think it's not about evidence. Like, it's not about, can you prove to me that there's actually a chance that we will make it through the eye of the needle? There's enough evidence to the contrary. But I think that if we live into the maturity of what it would mean to be a species destined to extinction but still alive, and find connection in being in right relationship to each other and to place again, even to the point that we maybe take the higher ground of saying, well, even if we don't make it, we can still regenerate and restore this place for life. We can still act as custodians of life beyond the survival of our species. Then we have the maturity to make it through the eye of the needle. So paradoxically, we have to stop thinking of, give me the evidence that we will survive. And we have to start thinking of, how do we heal the system, the tree of life that we are a branch of, irrespective of whether we survive. Because again, just like every solution of the past has become a problem of the present, 99.9% of the species on planet Earth have gone extinct. When the world's wisdom traditions, religious traditions, talk about eternal life, they have never promised eternal life to an individual or a species. They're talking about life being eternal. And if we reconnect to that deeper understanding, which all indigenous traditions had, of life as kin, and ultimately that is what needs to continue, then I think we can begin to build a world where we actually do have a future. It's a paradox. So I don't have any evidence, but I do fundamentally believe that life will survive, and most likely a lot of us will survive if we align with life as a regenerative process.
Life will find a way. All right, I'm going to add Stephen, you're now spotlit. Do you want to go ahead with your question?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so thanks for your conversation, both Sarah and Daniel. Appreciate it. Yeah, just want to ask the question, or or spotlight the phrase story of place, which I'm hearing a lot recently. And on face value, I totally agree with the importance of that idea, but both the word story and place are not easily defined, and can be informed by trauma as much as connection, and can be understood at different scales in terms of place. So yeah, can you just talk to us a little bit about how you understand that phrase?
Mm-hmm. In many ways, when we take a sort of bioregioning approach, the way we interact with the landscape is based on biogeophysical patterns, the river system behind me, the ecological patterns. And so the geology, the hydrology, how did the mountains form? Where are the rivers flowing? What was possible here in the deep past? And how has the current ecosystem evolved? All of that is part of the story of place. But since human beings in their indigenous native relationship with land are part of nature, the way that story, language, and culture has evolved in that place is also a biological reflection of that place. So culture, the ancient songs, the ancient rituals, the sacred places, the language itself, the names of places in the local language often carry the story of place. And when a regenerative development way of working, when we talk about the story of places, is that we need to create a shared understanding of what the place itself wants. Often the word is called that working regeneratively is to work in a place-sourced way. And in order to source out of place, you need to get the story of place clear. And working in a place-sourced way means to pay attention to the local knowledge, but also the current way that our maybe even mistaken story of place is interfering in different layers of place, like how the current political system might be completely ajar with what the place actually wants, what the story of place used to be about. And yeah, to make it more concrete, like I live on an island where one of the story of place, the patterns is that this island has been invaded for the last 3,000 years by everybody around the Mediterranean. And the last big invasions were the tourists or the Germans like me or that have come to the island to live here. So there's a really interesting and deep trauma in the local culture of how do you maintain your local culture when you're constantly getting these other people come and decide we're more powerful, we'll stay for a bit. And that's still very much in the land and in the language. And then Franco oppressed the Catalan language, which is another massive trauma. So you're absolutely right that another dimension of, and a very important dimension of story of place is to pay attention to why people can't see each other anymore, why they can't talk to each other more, what is the pattern of othering the other, and where does that come from? And it very often also is in the trauma that is in place. Does that give you a bit more of a sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Good question.
Okay, well, we're at the end of the hour. I don't know if we have any other burning questions, but I was just going to reflect one thing that as a transplanted American now in Australia, I really appreciate the retake on Descartes' I think, therefore I am, with that philosophy of I am here, therefore I am, that many Indigenous communities reflect on. And that's been something that really resonates with me. And I don't know how much you've come across that, Daniel, but I just wanted to shine a light on that for some of the other people on the call today, if they hadn't heard
One
that.
of my mentors, Satish Kumar, wrote a book called "You Are, Therefore I Am," and really what all the wisdoms traditions, but interestingly, in the last 50 years, the cutting edge of science has shown us is that we live in a relational universe where the whole can only perceive itself through what we experience as a separation from the whole. because you need a perspective in order to look at something. But what we actually all are is that whole experiencing itself. Life, and that's also one of the reasons why human beings are not a cancer on the planet and have a role in the evolution, is that we are one of the conscious reflections of the living process. And we have the capability to, which is where maybe our uniqueness to some extent lies, is in that we can live in stories, and we do live in stories, and we repeat like that. These stories are actually the meta design that shapes our worlds and our experience of reality. And so for and the sentence that you named of the now has another dimension that is also really important, which is that we are trapped in a mistaken understanding of time that constantly makes us think that we have to live in the future. But time is differently structured than this linear arrow that we've been taught. And again, indigenous ways of being, holistic consciousness, lives in time in a very, very different way than people who are in analytical consciousness. And that's what that sentence brings up in me. It's a very deep conversation. The Cartesian thing is at the heart of the story of separation.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, I have nothing else to add. Sarah, did you want to add anything?
Sorry, I was muttering away there on mute. But I love the line of stories are the meta design that shape our experience of reality. That's beautiful, and I think I've certainly loved having the chance to speak with you tonight and to hear some of your reflections. I think to move from the someone who is the expert and knows everything about regenerative design and to come and speak with us tonight or today in a way that is really very much asking us all to kind of learn to be present, to ask the questions, to not necessarily be the expert, but to be the expert listener and the expert observer and the expert enabler of life systems. I feel as though that's a strong message and a really powerful message for all of us who are on the call today and will be listening to this recording later. So yeah, thank you.
Let's dismantle the entire believing in experts. We're all wonderfully capable of being regenerative and doing that all the time. I'm not an expert in regenerative design. I'm just living the questions of what it means to live in a relational universe. So thank you very much for a lovely conversation, and thanks for inviting me. And blessings to places you call from. I hope I make it to Australia sometime. People want to get me, like I've been there, but recently I'm being convinced, people are trying to convince me to come to Australia. But
we'll have to work on that.
In place here at the moment. I'm a farmer. Farmers don't leave their place. But maybe
it's true. You have to protect it. Well, yeah, definitely. I think it'd be beautiful to stay in touch, Daniel, and maybe we can co-explore some different opportunities together, because really the end goal of the community is not just to share knowledge, but really to act on it. So, and a lot of us are doing a lot of pro bono work. So if there are opportunities that come up that you need a little bit of extra support with, please let us know. We're happy to help.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all. All right. Have a lovely day.
Thanks for
Thank you, Sarah. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye all.